How did the German army manage to get Panzergruppe Kleist across the Meuse River? We look at the main effort of Fall Gelb. Ladies and gentlemen, this episode is part 2 of our overview for the Battle of France 1940. Once again, a big thank you for Major Paul Knight from the British Army's Land Warfare Centre Lesson Exploitation Centre for these notes that have formed the basis of this podcast. The last episode saw the preparation for the Germans, the Allies, and for the neutrals, and the commencement of hostilities. And we picked the story up with the attack on the Belgian fort at Eben-Emael. Eben-Emael is a fort complex that sits on the Albert Canal River Meuse water feature opposite the Dutch city of Maastricht, which is located in a 10-mile wide slice of the Netherlands, and it protrudes between Belgium and Germany. This piece of cartography had no impact on Fall Gelb. The capture of the fort and 3 bridges over the Albert Canal by glider-borne troops was a significant achievement in its own right. There are some great books that you can read on it. So Chapter 5 of Sebag Montefiore's Dunkirk, the Osprey Fortress number 30, Fort Eben-Emael, and Osprey's Raid 38, The Fall of Eben-Emael. These are great books covered in significant detail. In reality, it was just one of several crossings made into eastern Belgium, setting aside operations in the Ardennes. As in the Netherlands, the Luftwaffe conducted devastating raids on the Belgian Air Force. Between that and losses incurred in a failed attempt to destroy the Albert Canal bridges late in the day, the Belgian Air Force was effectively destroyed. Attempts by German troops impersonating Dutch police to seize the Maastricht bridges failed, and all 3 were blown under the eyes of the 4th Panzer Division. However, German troops were able to cross the water features, and at 1100 hours, the city surrendered. German engineers set about building pontoon bridges, and in the early hours of the 11th, armoured vehicles were able to cross. These bridges were key terrain, and the British and French air forces launched sorties against them and armoured concentrations at choke points. A combination of anti-aircraft fire and the Luftwaffe providing top cover meant that these sorties failed, with significant losses to aircraft and aircrews. The Germans did recognise the efforts of the aircrew, attacked by heavy bombers, causing considerable delays. Any delay inflicted on the Germans aided the deployment of Plan D, and this was enacted smoothly. The BEF's 1st and 2nd Corps arrived in their positions unopposed on the 11th. It's at this point that the 72-hour countdown starts for the Germans as they cross into Luxembourg. They've given themselves 72 hours. That's the time that they think they'll need to have crossed the Meuse River. The first of 41,140 vehicles from Panzergruppe Kleist crossed the border into Luxembourg, then into Belgium. The chasseurs Ardennes in Matalonga were swept aside, but in the next village, Botonja, the 5th Company had not received their orders to withdraw because of Operation Niwi. It took all day to clear the defenders. The Germans had advanced 35 miles, mostly unopposed through Luxembourg, and there were still 50 miles to Sedan. In Belgium, the German invasion has been described as the Matador's Cloak. Its aim was to entice the best of the British and French manoeuvre formations into central Belgium and away from the German main effort, which would cross the River Meuse at Sedan and Monthermé. The German force was primarily infantry divisions who could march through Belgium as their fathers had done in 1914. Facing them would be the cream of the British and French armies. The regulars of the British Army, even if they had not been engaged in operations on the scale of the German invasion of Poland, had been toughened in the hard school of imperial policing. Commander of the 9th Infantry Brigade considered that his 3 battalions had schooled in scallywag tactics during the Arab rebellion in Palestine. For the French army, the Maginot Line had allowed the concentration of their best formations facing Belgium, including Prioux' mechanised cavalry corps, whose equipment was far superior to that which he would face in the Gembloux Gap. Prioux' cavalry corps advanced into the gap, a gentle ridge about 18 miles east of the Dial line. This took the form of a thin screen about 22 miles long, with the 3rd DLM to the north and the 2nd DLM to the south. The lead German units passed Warem and ran out of fuel. Junkers 52 transport aircraft airlifted in 20,000 litres of fuel. On the morning of the 12th of May, a company of Panzer 1 and 2s were ordered to capture the village of Hannut, but quickly ran into the French Hotchkiss H-39 tanks occupying the village of Créan on their flank. The Panzers approached with parade ground tactics, which were entirely inappropriate against the effective French 37 and 47mm weapons. The Germans reinforced, and with the effective use of radios, were able to encircle the village and drive the French out by the end of the day. The Germans then advanced on the village of Tina, but a costly French counterattack recovered Créan and forced the Germans to call off the attack on Tina. The battle resumed on the 13th and initially focused on the village of Meudon. French superior artillery and the 47mm guns of the Saumur S-35 tanks initially held the Germans off. However, German infantry infiltrated the village and attacked both the infantry and anti-tank gun crews. The French withdrew in the mid-afternoon. Following further breakthroughs of the French line at Jean-Gendrin, Prioux ordered a general withdrawal. Fighting continued on the 14th around Gembloux, where German armour failed to make significant progress, while suffering significant casualties and degradation of capability in the process. Prioux had, however, achieved his purpose of delaying the German advance while Plan D was put into effect, and he could withdraw now to the main First Army positions. Unfortunately, the events on the Meuse would undermine his achievements. The first German troops were observed from the Dial line late on the 14th of May. Attempts were made to cross the defensive positions and defeat the defenders, but without success. Lieutenant Dick Anand of the Durham Light Infantry would be awarded the Victoria Cross in one such action. In the early hours of the 16th, a withdrawal to the River Escaut was commenced. All 3 corps of the BEF would be deployed from Tournai, with 2 divisions south of the city, northwards to the Belgian army, which held from Ardennes northwards towards Ghent. To the south of the BF was the French First Army, and behind the BF was Lille. The Escaut line would be held until the 21st of May. Again, there were numerous German attempts to penetrate the line, but without success. This did require several desperate counterattacks, including the 8th Royal Warwicks and the 3rd Grenadier Guards. The deteriorating situation to the south led to a series of ad hoc formations being created, starting with Mac Force under the command of Lord Gort's Director of Intelligence, General Noel Mason McFarlane, created on the 17th of May and based around the territorials of the 125th Infantry Brigade. They were transported the 15 miles from their east-facing divisional positions around Tournai to south-facing positions on the River Scarpe. The brigade commander described the impact of this move on the men in what was clearly an understatement. This sudden volte-face was certainly a bit upsetting. With German armour reaching the Channel coast on the 20th of May, even the Escaut line was no longer tenable. On the night of the 22nd, 23rd of May, the BEF was ordered from the Escaut line to the Gort line, which they had departed from less than a fortnight before. On the 26th, General Blanchard, commanding the French First Army, ordered a general withdrawal to Dunkirk, and that evening the evacuations began. 4 BEF divisions, 1st, 3rd, 4th and 42nd, were withdrawn from the area around Lille. 4th and 42nd divisions would occupy south-facing positions along the River Lys. The 5th and 50th divisions would be moved from Arras following their involvement in the counterattack there, and now occupied positions along the Ypres-Comines Canal and the ridge extending south of Ypres, so infamous from the First World War. On the 27th of May, they fought a delaying action there, which allowed the 3rd Division to be extracted, pass to the west of the ridge and take up new positions north of Ypres. The 1st Division was withdrawn to the Dunkirk perimeter. What was now the eastern flank of a corridor retiring on Dunkirk withdrew in controlled stages. The ability to disengage, withdraw, and establish new defensive positions on the next major water feature was crucial to the retreat into the Dunkirk perimeter. The 3rd and 50th Divisions occupied a line from Nordschott to Luzerne to Poperinghe, through which the 4th and 42nd Divisions were able to retire. The 5th and 42nd Divisions occupied new positions along the River Meuse, while 4th Division withdrew to the Dunkirk perimeter. From the Meuse position, 5th and 42nd Divisions retired into the Dunkirk perimeter, and for 42nd Division, it was during this final move that they came under the most concentrated attacks from German armour, which resulted in the fragmentation of the division. The remainder of the French First Army was trapped in the Little Pocket from the 28th of May until the 1st of June, when an honourable surrender was agreed with the German besiegers. 40,000 troops marched out with the honours of war. Critically, their actions had engaged 3 Panzer and 4 infantry divisions for 4 days. Let's turn our attention now further south as we look at the crossing of the Meuse with Army Group A. From the German perspective, the events that unfolded through the Ardennes, across the Meuse, through France to the coast, and then northwards through the Channel ports was not some part of a genius master plan. It was the product of gross insubordination. Communication with Rommel, who was commanding 7th Panzer Division, would inexplicably fail at key moments, for instance, when the first Halt Order was being transmitted. From the French perspective, they did not believe that the Ardennes was impassable, as the myth has been generated since 1940 claims. They were aware of German columns in the Ardennes from the morning of the 10th of May, but they considered these to be a feint. If there was an underestimation, it was on the length of time it would take the Germans to reach the Meuse. Furthermore, the column was heading for Sedan, where the defences were substantial, and the failure of all attempts to cross that river, except for one, supported their confidence. French interwar doctrine emphasised the methodical battle, which brought all of the necessary elements together to launch a coordinated attack. This was a refinement of the doctrine which had won the First World War. Unfortunately, it was slow and cumbersome, and it could be disrupted by the appearance of even minor enemy units. This allowed German armour to break through into the undefended rear areas, precisely where the French 7th Army should have been. Within Army Group A, 12th Army under List included Panzergruppe Kleist of 3 corps, Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, Reinhardt's 31st Panzer Corps, and Wittersheim's 14th Motorised Corps. Also in 4th Army, which was under von Kluge, operating to the north, there was Hoth's 15th Panzer Corps. Its 41,140 vehicles would stretch 1,540 kilometres, the entire width of the Reich from Luxembourg to East Prussia. For Fall Gelb, they were allocated just 4 roads and would advance in echelon of corps. This march plan failed on the first day as Guderian fought through Belgian defenders and overcame counter-mobility obstacles. Reinhardt's corps concertinaed into Guderian, and Wittersheim sat inactive, still in Germany. The situation was made worse when panzer divisions pushed on to keep up to the timetable without making appropriate repairs for wheeled vehicles following on. By the 12th of May, Army Group A had created the greatest traffic jam in Europe. The first Belgian resistance, which was encountered at Matalonge, was initially very fierce, and it was overcome by German speed and surprise. Badange would be a tougher proposition, and it took all day before the defending company there was defeated. Now, the irony of this is that it was Operation Niwi that prevented the order to withdraw from reaching the defenders of Badange. Niwi was an air landing operation to occupy 2 villages, Nives and Witre, and cut the communications and prevent the forward movement of reinforcers, and to capture a series of pillboxes. With all of the Junkers 52 transport aircraft allocated to operations in the Netherlands, the Luftwaffe relied on the Friesler-Storch liaison aircraft. It could only take 2 passengers, and 400 troops were involved. This necessitated 2 lifts, but despite a combination of aircraft getting lost and damaged, sufficient troops landed to achieve their tasks. They were relieved by elements of 1st Panzer Division later on the 10th. French troops established a defensive line at Neufchâteau. The Germans should have arrived on the 10th, but when they arrived early on the 11th, they again applied speed and aggression to punch through, demoralise and rout the French. The next obstacle was Boulogne, which was considered by the German planners to be a major obstacle in the crossing of the Seine River. The town sits in a steeply wooded gorge with a very tight loop in the Seine, with a medieval fortress in the centre. The 1st Panzer Division routed the French 5th Light Cavalry Division, which fled back and through Boulogne and was pursued by panzers. The panzers drove at speed through the steep town to the 2 bridges over the Seine. The lead panzer was metres away from the southern bridge when it was blown, and then the panzer suffered a mobility kill from an anti-tank gun across the river. The northern bridge was already blown, but a ford was identified and the panzers crossed. The panzers also suffered long-range artillery fire from inside France and a blue-on-blue attack from Stukas. French troops now withdrew from Boulogne, which was the last natural obstacle before Sedan. The road to Sedan was not yet open. Pillboxes disguised as country houses and well sighted with anti-tank guns had been constructed. One at Le Hatrel took 4 hours to clear. Elements of Guderian's Panzer Corps reached the Meuse on the 13th of May as planned. His immediate problem was that his artillery was somewhere in the traffic jam of the Ardennes, whereas the French 55th Infantry Division, in addition to its own superiority, both in tubes and ammunition stocks, could call upon the support from 10th and 41st Corps and the fortresses at Charleville and Mézières. The German shortcomings were compensated for by a massive air raid of 1,250 sorties along a 4-kilometre stretch of the Meuse. Although the physical destruction was minimal, the psychological effect on the defenders was immense. The crossing of the Meuse was extremely complicated, with multiple units from several divisions making courageous crossings followed by difficult infiltrations. These were undertaken by infantry and engineer units who created significant bridgeheads without the support of the panzers. Chapter 5 of Friese's Blitzkrieg legend goes into this in a lot more detail, and it's well worth having a look at because it just does highlight many of the issues and the determination to force that river crossing, often under extremely unfavourable odds. Concurrent to the crossings, but in reality totally removed from them, is what Frieser called the oddest incident of the campaign in the West. This occurred at Fondaugeau Wood near Bulson, the location of the French headquarters for the 55th Infantry Division on the 13th of May. A mass psychosis erupted into a catastrophe with stunning speed. In the evening, French troops started pouring to the rear, insisting that they had seen German infantry and panzers. Officers even claimed to have received orders to withdraw. The great irony of this was that there were no German troops in the area and no panzers across the river. The first clash between French and German armour didn't take place in Bulson until the morning of the 14th. We'll look at this in a lot more detail when we look at morale, because I think it is a fundamental component of what the Blitzkrieg type tactics can generate, that shock action of armour. But we'll also look at how some of the French troops, and in particular the French High Command, had developed such a fragile state of mind when it came to conducting operations. The first German bridge over the Meuse was not constructed until the 14th of May. Some 600 panzers would cross this single bridge, making it the most important asset in the West. It had been built with every last piece of pontoon equipment, and there were no more available to repair any damage. Consequently, this bridge was attacked by large numbers of British and French aircraft without success and with massive casualties. The French 10th Corps did not remain inactive in response to both the panic in the 55th Division and the creation of the armour-carrying pontoon bridges over the Meuse. What would develop, however, would be a series of delays which prevented the counterattack from ever being delivered in any meaningful manner. The failure of the French Corps to, at the very least, contain the limited German bridgeheads and to bring their superior artillery to bear on the key infrastructure assets, the pontoon bridges, is a significant failure for the French army. The following day, the 15th of May, Winston Churchill received the following bad news. I was woken with the news that Monsieur Reynard was on the telephone at my bedside. He spoke in English and evidently under stress. "We have been defeated." As I did not immediately respond, he said again, "We are beaten. We have lost the battle." I said, "Surely it can't have happened so soon." But he replied, "The front is broken near Sedan. They are pouring through in great numbers with tanks and armoured cars." There was one final feature along which the French could hope to hold the German advance: Ston. This would go down in French military history as an action comparable to Cambrai in British armoured history. Ston was approached by the 10th Panzer Division advancing southwards from Sedan on the 15th of May. From the French perspective, this is what they expected from the Germans. Confirmation bias supported an assumption that the Germans would turn south to strike against the Maginot Line. This would not actually happen until Fall Gelb was launched on the 5th of June. By the time the 10th Panzer Division reached Ston, 15 miles to the south, 6th Panzer Division had driven from Monthermé to Montcornet, 40 miles due west, while 7th Panzer Division had crossed the Meuse at Dinant and also advanced 40 miles due west to Freude-Chapelle. 1st, 2nd and 5th Panzer Divisions were also advancing westward, although they had not created their own salient. The westward movement of the panzers was evident. Ston was indicative of the ferocity which the French army could deliver. Located on a ridge dominating the surrounding terrain, Ston is approached from the north by a road climbing steeply along the ridge before a hairpin bend took the road back along the summit of the ridge into the village itself. It's hardly tank country. Between the 15th and 17th, Ston would change sides 17 times. One of the French Chars B1 bis, commanded by Pierre Bilot, received 140 hits but destroyed 13 German tanks and several anti-tank guns. The bulk of the German panzer divisions were now advancing westward. Frieser calls this Guderian's unauthorised thrust. The German High Command expected the panzers to wait on the Meuse bridgehead for the infantry support to catch up. The panzer commanders expected to continue their advance before the Allies could react, but their advances would create vulnerable, exposed flanks, which the German High Command, including Hitler, wanted to avoid. This is a fascinating area of study, the trade-off of secure flanks for depth in penetration and the psychological impact that that has on the High Command of the French Army and the High Command of the German Army. The panic that is created within the French High Command as these penetrations continue to go deeper into French territory is almost matched by the panic within the German High Command about the incredible danger of a likely counterattack and what that would do to these deep penetrations, which are completely unsecured by any supporting infantry because they have moved so far in advance of them. Future President of France, Charles de Gaulle, his 4th Armoured Division counterattacked into Montcornet on the 17th in an action which realised the risk of the exposed flanks which the panzer spearheads were exposed to. The counterattack inflicted damage and casualties but was unsupported, and the French were forced to withdraw once the fuel and ammunition was exhausted. On the 18th of May, the BEF was alerted to the extent of the German thrust through French areas devoid of defenders. The only troops in the areas were 2 second-line territorial divisions, the 12th and the 23rd, who had been employed as line of communications troops and on construction duties. These formations had only been raised in 1939 and were as yet not fully trained and lacked vehicles, communications equipment and heavy weapons. The justification for their premature deployment to France was to show commitment to the French, and with the understanding that they would complete their training in a safe area of France. Now they were the only Allied formations between the Panzers and the English Channel. Apart from the psychological and propaganda impact of reaching the sea, it would cut through the BEF's logistics tail. Unlike the First World War, where the Channel ports were considered safe seaports of debarkation, the threat of air power made those ports vulnerable. In 1940, the BEF's logistics tail extended back to the Normandy ports and Cherbourg. The British 1st Armoured Division was forming up in Normandy and would be isolated from the BEF. Sebag Montefiore entitled his chapter Lambs to the Slaughter. 23rd Division only consisted of 2 brigades and was initially deployed to defend the dry Canal du Nord, but were repositioned once the canal was crossed elsewhere. The 8th Panzer Division caught 70th Brigade near Wancourt and destroyed it. 69th Brigade was able to withdraw northwards to Dunkirk. 12th Division's units were dispersed around Luchau, Albert, Amiens and Abbeville. Both divisions were destroyed as fighting formations, although the 69th Brigade would make it home to Britain and return to the war in North Africa as a part of 50th Division. They were destroyed in detail during the 20th, and elements of the 10th Panzer Division reached the sea later that day. The following day, the 21st of May, 4th and 7th Battalion, Royal Tank Regiment, and the 6th and 8th Battalion, Durham Light Infantry, launched twin counterattacks from Arras into the exposed flank of the 7th Panzer Division's logistics tail. Like de Gaulle's earlier counterattack, the potential of that at Arras was severely limited by the speed with which it was executed and the resources available. Critically, neither the infantry nor the armour had trained together previously. With the panzers on the coast and turning northwards, Boulogne and Calais now became key positions. 20th Guards Brigade arrived in Boulogne on the 23rd, but with an accurate realisation of the military situation. They were re-embarked after a short stay and returned to Britain. The political fallout of this apparent desertion of the French defenders means that when 30th Brigade landed in Calais on the 23rd, there would be no evacuation. They would fight until the end of the 25th. General Alan Brooke, commanding the British Second Corps, wrote in his diary of the desperate situation on the 23rd of May, "Nothing short of a miracle can save the BEF now, and the end cannot be very far off." At 12:45 p.m. the following day, one of the most controversial and still much debated orders of the war was issued, which became known as Hitler's Halt Order. On orders of the Führer, the attack to the east of Arras is to be continued with 8th Corps and to the northwest 2nd Corps in cooperation with the left wing of Army Group B. The general lines of Lens, Bethune, Arras, Saint-Omer and Gravelines will not be crossed northwest of Arras. Various justifications have been given for the Halt Order, including the need to rest the crews and maintain the vehicles, to allow the infantry to catch up and reduce the risk of an overextended logistics tail, and to preserve the armour for operations after the destruction of the Dunkirk pocket. Regardless, General Heinz Guderian was furious. We were utterly speechless, but since we had not informed of the reason for the order, it was difficult to argue against it. The Panzer Divisions were therefore instructed, hold the line of the Canal, make the use of the period for rest and recuperation. It also provided the miracle which Alan Brooke had prayed for. When the Halt Order was lifted on the 27th of May, 2nd Division was holding the La Bassée Canal line. They faced 4th, 5th and 7th Panzer Divisions, plus SS Totenkopf and SS Wehrpflügung divisions. Their determined resistance inflicted significant delay and casualties, but resulted in the La Paradis massacre. Another determined event at Womeau by the 144th Brigade was followed by a second massacre. These defences and Cassel were crucial in maintaining the western border of the Dunkirk perimeter for formations to pass through towards Dunkirk. The defence of Cassel was made possible by the Halt Order. Without it, it is likely that the defenders would have been debussing about the same time as the 11th Panzer Division arrived. The defenders had a critical few days to prepare a hilltop location which dominated the locality. Germans were seen approaching Cassel on the evening of the 27th. Without infantry support, the German panzers experienced difficulties breaking through into the medieval hilltop strongpoint. On the evening of the 28th, orders to withdraw from Cassel were sent by dispatch rider, but due to getting lost in enemy action, the message was not delivered until the 29th. The result of this delay meant that by the time a withdrawal could be implemented, it was too late, and many of the garrison were captured. The defence of the Dunkirk perimeter was a scene of many heroic actions, the most notable being that of Captain Irvine Andrews, East Lancashire Regiment, who was awarded the Victoria Cross. As the evacuation proceeded, there were fewer and fewer British formations to hold the line. The responsibility of defence increasingly passed to the French army. With the British evacuation completed, a final effort was made to rescue as many of the French army remaining as possible. On the last night, 27,000 were evacuated. HMS Shikari cast off at 0340 hours on the 4th of June 1940. On board was General Lucas, the GOC, the French 32nd Infantry Division. He saluted some 1,000 officers and men on the pier, formed up in 4 ranks, who returned the salute. These were amongst the 40,000 French defenders of Dunkirk who would become prisoners of war when the Germans entered the city later that day. The capture of Dunkirk marked the end of Fall Gelb, but it did not end the Battle of France. Fall Rot, or Case Red, was for the conquest of the remainder of France, and that commenced on the 5th of June. There were also attempts to deploy the 2nd BEF to support the French, although political and military reality soon ordered its withdrawal. The evacuations would continue into July with disastrous consequences. The French were still able to deploy 64 divisions along the River Somme, although their best had been destroyed to the north. The stiff resistance which they had initially offered showed that their morale had recovered from the events in May. The Maginot Line was still intact to protect the eastern border. There were also some 100,000 British troops, including the 51st Highland Division, which took up positions along the Somme. However, German Army Group A contained 47 of their best divisions, and their aerial superiority had increased compared with May. It would take 3 days of costly attacks before the Germans finally gained footholds across the Somme. 7th Battalion, Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, suffered over 500 casualties on the 5th of June during these desperate actions. Further to the west, 4th Battalion, the Border Regiment, held out in the village of Inchaville for 5 days, despite being surrounded and the front line having moved much further to the west. The French Air Force was largely destroyed after attempting to interdict the German attacks. Several RAF units, which had been withdrawn southwards in May, remained active. On the 10th of June, Paris was declared an open city. Once the Somme defences had been broken, 5th and 7th Panzer Divisions continued their rapid advances and captured Riom before turning north to the Normandy coast. There, 51st Division was serving as part of Marcel Ihler's 9th Corps, which was attempting to make its way to Le Havre and evacuate. Once again, the disparity between the motorised British and French on foot came into play. The speed of the advance was slow, and the Corps was trapped in Saint-Valéry-en-Caux. Attempts were made at another rescue, but Saint-Valery was no Dunkirk. Saint-Valery was a small fishing port with a narrow entrance and surrounded by steep cliffs, which the Germans were able to occupy and dominate the approaches. Greater distances from England, fog, and lack of communications hampered rescue attempts. Around 2,230 personnel were evacuated from the port. On the 12th of June, General Ihler decided to surrender without consulting General Fortune, the GOC 51st Division, whose preferred option was to hold on and attempt another escape that evening. This disaster has been described as Churchill's sacrifice. The division was operating within a French corps which curtailed its operation of freedom, and at a much greater distance compared with those divisions operating in northeast France. More than 10,000 troops of the 51st Highland Division were taken prisoner at Saint-Valéry. A 2nd BF was organised under General Alan Brooke, who, having evacuated from Dunkirk, now returned via Cherbourg. This consisted of part of the 1st Armoured Division, which had landed in Normandy but had been unable to join the BEF after the Germans reached the Channel, and Beaumont's Division, an ad hoc formation of line of communication troops in Normandy. Both of these formations had been engaged in actions alongside the French, but had been inevitably forced westwards. They were now joined by the 52nd Lowland Division and the 1st Canadian Division. However, Brooke's assessment of the military situation was that it could not be saved, and he ordered the withdrawal of the 2nd BEF. In addition to Operation Dynamo, which was the evacuation from Dunkirk, there was Operations Cyclone from the Normandy ports and included A Brigade of Beaumont's Division and 154th Brigade of the 51st Division, and Operation Ariel from the Atlantic ports. Both of these operations were increasingly difficult due to the distances from English ports and their dispersed nature, which made coordination of ships and refugees difficult. These ports were also beyond the range of RAF fighter cover. Nevertheless, hundreds of thousands of servicemen and civilians from a wide range of Allied nations were evacuated. Unfortunately, Ariel also included the UK's worst maritime tragedy. RMS Lancastria normally sailed with 2,000 passengers and crew, but on this occasion she was believed to have been loaded up with 6,700 service passengers when it was bombed and sunk in the Saint-Nazaire estuary. 2,477 were rescued, but an estimated 3,500 men, women and children were lost. The Maginot Line retained all of its immobile potency. German Army Group C had failed to make any significant progress against it. With the fall of Dunkirk, Army Group A was now free to move in support. In order to defend the River Somme, the French 2nd Army Group had been redeployed. This removed from the Maginot Line most of its manoeuvre formations and left it vulnerable to attack. On the 15th of June, Army Group C launched Operation Tiger, a frontal attack on the Maginot Line. 2 days later, Army Group A reached the Franco-Swiss border, passing to the west of the Maginot Line and isolating it from the rest of France. Vulnerable to attack from the rear, the fate of the fortifications was sealed. The Germans estimated that 500,000 French soldiers were captured. This far exceeded the tally of operations in northeast France. Not wanting to miss out on the spoils of victory, Benito Mussolini declared war on France and Britain on the 10th of June. His military chiefs considered that Italy was not ready for war, and their initial attacks against an already defeated France were embarrassingly unsuccessful. The main threat that they posed to Britain was from Libya, where they could invade Egypt. The 11th Hussars took the initiative, raiding across the border and returning with 70 Italian prisoners on the 12th of June. The potential threat of the Italian 10th Army against the Western Desert Force at a time when the UK was facing imminent invasion and the Battle of Britain was raging was a serious cause of concern. That the Italians did not invade Egypt until the 13th of September and that they were halted at Sidi Barrani was nothing short of a miracle for the British. The Italians dug in and remained in place for over half a year until the 9th of December 1940, when General Wavell launched Operation Compass and destroyed the Italian 10th Army. So, in conclusion, for the BEF, it performed its role as the junior partner in a Franco-Belgian-British coalition. At the strategic level, it was the failure of the French army to halt the German panzers on the Meuse, which unravelled Plan D. This failure was almost guaranteed once the 7th Army was removed from its role in the strategic reserve and sent to assist the Dutch, where it achieved little. At the operational and tactical level, the British and French troops invariably, but not always, held their own against the Germans. It is easy to focus on the effect of confident, aggressive panzer divisions moving at speed into confused and demoralised dismounted infantry. Where there exists such an imbalance of capabilities, the outcome will usually be disastrous. Where the Allies met the Germans on a more equal footing, the Germans were less impressive than the popular focus on a few panzer divisions would suggest. In this scenario, and despite the Anglo-centric concentration on the BEF's actions, there is nothing which the BEF could do except retire in good order and escape to fight another day. That the BEF was able to achieve this in the increasingly pressured, congested and confused environment of late May 1940 is a remarkable achievement. What is even more remarkable is that of the 13 infantry divisions, 8 were territorials and 3 of those were second-line territorial divisions raised just the year before. Despite the iconic status applied to the panzers for their much over-publicised role in 1940, the unique factor which characterised the campaign was the BEF's 3-ton lorry. Their ability to redeploy troops either in the retirement or to plug holes in the line was critical in saving the BEF and therefore enable the evacuation, which provided the nucleus of the personnel required to scale up the Allied armies for the invasion of Germany. The next episode will look at the centre of gravity analysis, where we're going to start to pick at some of the really interesting points that come out of the desired end states for each of the stakeholders in the Battle of France 1940.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.jamesealing.com. theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.